So let's talk about an allocation trick in QuickBooks Desktop. By QuickBooks Desktop, I'm referring to QuickBooks Pro, QuickBooks Premier, QuickBooks Accountant, or QuickBooks Enterprise. This is the version of QuickBooks that is installed in a Windows machine. Anyway, this is going to be useful to allocate across multiple accounts, multiple classes, or multiple customers and jobs for the purpose of reporting, pretty much. And it can work with all of these, so we can actually use these techniques to do different customers, different classes, different accounts, or it could be some of them or just one in particular. There are three particular scenarios that we're going to be used for the example. One is on the income side. So how do we allocate different income accounts and classes on a single sales transaction? The second scenario we're going to do is allocating to different expenses, classes, or customer jobs in a single expense transaction. And the third example is allocating across multiple classes and customers at the end of a period, typically when there's multiple transactions hitting a generic class or a generic customer or no class or no customer, and then using transaction to allocate across all of those. So for the first example, we're going to allocate different income and classes in a single sales transaction. So the first step is we have to create multiple items or use multiple items that point to different accounts. So we'll do an example of that. Then we're going to create a group that contains all those items. And you're not going to put a check mark where it says print items in the group. And I'll show you an example of that. And finally, we'll use that group in an invoice. That way the customer doesn't see all the individual items, they only see one item. But internally for reporting purposes, we're going to see different accounts and different classes being used. So let me put it into an example and let me go into the item list. So I'm going to go to list, item list, and then I'm going to go look for the items that I'm going to use. So let me start with this first item here called miscellaneous items, and I'll show you how I did it. So I created a service item. Now it could be service or it could be other charge. It doesn't really matter, but I created this one called miscellaneous items, and this one is hitting or is linked to the miscellaneous income account. Okay, so that's one of the items that is going to be used. Then this one here called custom work. This one is going to be assigned to the installation revenue account. So this one's going to hit installation revenue. And then I'm also going to sell one of these products. So I'm just going to pick one at random here. Let me pick one of these chandeliers. Okay, and we'll grab this one here and we'll edit that to see where that's going. And that is going to the product sales account. Now, the next step is to create a new group. So I'm going to go to right click new, right? Or I'm going to click on item new or control N. And then I'm going to pick group. And then once I pick group, I'm going to call this, let's call it here chandelier installed or whatever, right? Then I'm going to pick the items that I'm going to sell. So let me pick the product and that's going to hit my product sales account. And let me hit my custom work, which is going to affect my installation sales account. So I'm going to put a 1 on the quantity for that one. And then the last one, I'll use that miscellaneous items. That's going to affect that miscellaneous revenue account. And right here where it says print items from group, I'm going to make sure that's going to have to remain unchecked. That way it doesn't show up on the invoice, because that's what we're trying to show you here is how to have it look like one thing, but it actually affects multiple accounts and classes. Okay, so let me go into an invoice here and I'll pick up a customer. And then my job here is to select that group. Okay, so I'm going to pick that group that I created. And that group is going to go ahead and put my product, my custom work, and my miscellaneous items. So it's actually hitting three different items, and each of those items is hitting three different income accounts. Now under class, unfortunately, I can't preset that on the group settings, so that's going to have to be a manual piece. So I'm going to have to come in here and select the class for each of these, right? So I'm going to choose the class, and then let's say I'm trying to sell this chandelier installed and charge some materials as well, but I don't want my client to see all that. So I'm going to put here the installation cost. So let me put here $250 here, and then maybe 115 for miscellaneous. So the total price for the customer is going to be 665. When the customer sees this invoice printed or emailed, they're only going to see one item that says chandelier installed. Actually, let me show you. Let me do a preview so we can see exactly what that looks like. So they see the chandelier is installed, and then they see the dollar amount. So we're not really breaking it down from the customer's perspective, but we are breaking it down internally. So once I save that, I'm gonna go ahead and save that, and I'm gonna go into my profit and loss that I already had it open here, and I'm gonna look at profit and loss by total only, just so we can focus on the three income categories. So we had what seemed to be a single line item. For the customer's purpose, it ended up being three different income accounts because of the items that it was using, and they're hidden. But also for classes, it did the same thing. So when I selected by class here, you're going to see here how classes are split up based on how I put them on the invoice. So that's how you allocate to different accounts and different classes in a sales transaction. The next example, we're going to allocate multiple classes using a single expense transaction, like a check. So we're going to write a check to, let's say, our rent, and we want that rent expense to hit across 10 classes. So the steps are: create an item for the expense account that you want to allocate first. Then create a group that contains that item multiple times, however many classes you need to allocate to. Then use the decimal version of a percent. So if you're going to do 10%, use 0.10. If you're going to do 50%, do 0.50, etc. And you're going to put that in the quantity area that you want to allocate. And then we're going to create the check to pay the expense and use that group item, which is going to automatically populate all the items multiple times, and you're just going to add the classes that you want to allocate to. Finally, you're going to probably going to want to memorize the transaction, because if it shows up again, you don't want to do all the steps over again. All right, so let's do the example. So I'm here on my item item list, and I'm going to create a new item called rent. So I'm going to just create a new item. We'll call it service. Service is fine. And we'll call this rent expense. Okay. And the account that is going to hit naturally is going to be our rent account. Okay. So this is an expense account, and this item is going to be used in a bill or in a check. So we're going to go ahead and hit OK. And then let's create a new group. So I'm going to go to item new, and then I'm going to select the group here, and I'm going to call this rent expense allocation. Okay, so let's say, for example, I have 10 classes and I need that rent to hit equally across all 10 classes. Now, it doesn't have to be equal. You're not stuck with it being equal. I'm just using equal for this percentage, but you can actually use any percentage you want. So let me put here rent expense, and then I have to copy this 10 times. So here, rent expense, perfect. Okay, so what I did is I put rent expense 10 times, and I put here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. This is just as a peg holder for me to just make sure that I had enough of there. It gets a little bit confusing because this box is so small. It only has 4 lines in there or 5 lines in there. And once you scroll down, it's hard to keep track. So I'm just doing that 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 as a peg holder. But really, what I need to do is put point, in this case, is 10%. So I'm going to do 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. And again, if it's not equal amounts, you put whatever percentage you want, right? If something is 20% and the other one is 30% and so forth, you put it. Okay, so now I'm putting 0.1 in all of these, so they become 100% equal, all 10 of them. So let me hit OK, and let me go ahead and write a check. And I'll write a check to my landlord. So let's guess this is my landlord here. And I'm going to select not expenses, right? I have to go to items. So this is really the part that confuses some people, because they're sort of very used to go to expenses, and it will take a very long time to sit there and type rent and select every single one of the classes. That will take a very long time. So so I think it's a lot easier to go into items, select that rent expense allocation group, right? That's the one that we just created. And as soon as I do that, we're going to see how all these rent expense items are going to be duplicated 10 times, and the quantity here is going to be point 0.1. And then I'm going to come here into classes and select every one of the classes. And this is the only part that takes a little bit of time. Unfortunately, I cannot save the classes on the report grouping. So this is why at the very end, I strongly recommend that you go ahead and memorize the report if the expense, I mean, sorry, not the report, but the transaction. If the expense shows up again in the future, you can just recall it. But we're going to talk about, there's a little bit of an automation concept. It's not automated, but it's like semi-automated. And it's going to make a lot of sense once I finish putting all these together. And this only really works. This only really works if I have under the cost amount. It only really works if I have a numerical value. So I made the mistake of not putting a numerical value there. So I'm gonna have to go back into that rent expense and put a numerical value in there. So let me just go back here and go to the item list and look for my rent expense and right click edit, and that was a very crucial moment. I was supposed to put a 1 there, and you're going to see how that works in a second. Okay, so far I have a 1 under cost for every one of my rent expenses, and the quantity is 0.1. So if I multiply 0.1 10 times, I get $1. So naturally it's $1. Now what happens when the check amount, let's say, is $2,867? Now the way I get that dollar amount to be split equally across all the classes is I need to make sure that that dollar amount, that 2867, gets put under the quantity box right on the rent expense allocation. So under the group item rent expense allocation in the quantity box, I'm going to put that dollar amount in there. So what's going to happen is once I put that dollar amount in there as a quantity, QuickBooks will automatically split that among all the different expense accounts. Let's say 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, multiply that times 1. So naturally, you're going to get all these splits. And this will work the same exact way if you were splitting these across customers, right? So if you were doing an allocation by customer, it will work the exact same way. So this works for customers and it works for classes. Okay, and if you happen to be also splitting across different expense accounts, it would also work this way. You would just have to use a different item with a different pointing to a different expense account. So I'm going to go ahead and hit save and close. Actually, let me make sure that I put a date. Okay, I'm going to hit save and close, and then I'm going to pull a report so you can see exactly what that looks like. So I'm going to pull a profit and loss, and I'm going to use the same date as that transaction. I'm going to hit refresh, and then I'm going to click on show columns by class. And you're going to see exactly how rent expense goes across a whole bunch of classes. So that's how you get a single transaction allocated to multiple classes. So the last scenario is allocating an expense to multiple classes, but not transaction by transaction at the end of the period. So that way we can leave all the expense accounts unclassified, and then at the end of the period, we can create one transaction that would actually make this whole allocation. So the steps are the same as the previous example. So you follow those steps exactly. Create an item for the expense account, create a group with those items, duplicate it as many classes you have, use the quantity with the percentages. So that stays the same. But we're going to create a $0 bill. Basically, we're going to create a bill that nets $0 amount that's going to use the classes, the items and the classes for their allocations as a positive number. And then the total amount for all of them is going to go in as a negative number without any class at all. That way our financial statements are not modified in any numerical value, but our allocation works well. So let me use the example here, and I'm going to start by showing a profit and loss by class. Okay, and this is the issue that we're trying to tackle. So inside of this class, we have an insurance expense of 1,442. If I were to double click on that, I see that there's 4 transactions affecting that expense account, and I really don't want to do this transaction by transaction. So what I want to do is I want to take those 1,442 and spread it across the classes. And yes, you could use a journal entry. That's totally okay also. And I have another video. I'll put the the link down there in the comments. I have another video where I explain how to do that with a journal entry, and you're welcome to do that, but we're trying to do this as fast and automated as possible. So let's go into the item list and let's create a new item called insurance expense. It could be a service item. So we'll call this insurance expense, and we'll make sure that that hits our insurance expense account. And we're ignoring sub accounts at the moment. The rate, as I mentioned on the last example, it has to be 1, and then I'll hit OK. And then we're going to go ahead and create a new group, and we'll call this insurance expense location. Okay, and then I'm going to make sure that, let me just spell this correctly, and then use that insurance expense account that we just created 7 times. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, why 7 times? Just we happen to have 7 classes that we want to allocate to. Okay, so it's not like a magic number or anything. Okay, and let's say we have a diverse allocation. So let's say for one of the classes is 20%, for another one is 15, for another one is 10, for another one is 25, and let me see, that's 35, 45, 25, then 15, and then 15 more. I think I have this calculated correctly. We'll double check that at the end in a second. So I'm gonna hit OK, and let me go ahead and create a bill. So I'm gonna go to vendor, enter bill, and I'm gonna go to item and select our insurance allocation one. There we go. And yeah, that's more than 100%, right? Because that adds up to 145. So, obviously I was kind of doing these at random. So I just need to know how to fix it. So I'm going to go ahead and fix it. Okay, so I went back and I fixed one of my percentages. And okay, so this is the percentage of each class that is going to be allocated: 20%, 15%, 10%. So I'm going to pick here the classes that this belongs to. And again, I'm assuming that I already knew this beforehand, and I used some scientific method of knowing how to send stuff to what classes, right? So that's typically something that gets done with either square footage, or some people use their revenue, their sales, as the indicator of how are they going to send stuff to what classes. On that same video that I mentioned earlier, we're going to use that I actually explained different methods for that. So let me, before I save this, let me look for that dollar amount again. So that dollar amount was, I believe it was 1,442. Let's get the exact dollar amount here from the profit and loss report. Okay, there it is, 1,442.85. And this is the only manual process here where I actually have to manually put that number there. So the amount due in the bill itself, that's going to be 0. And because that needs to be zeroed out at the end, and I'll show you why and how that works. And on the very last item here, I'm going to choose this insurance expense account and put a negative amount, and I'll put negative 1442.82. I believe it was the decimals. Okay, so the very last line has to hit one expense account, and it has to hit the entire dollar amount as a negative. That's the rule. And at the end, the items here should net out to 0, because the bill is going to have a $0 amount. And as I mentioned before, we have to make sure that under the quantity box, right, that quantity box right there, that's in the same line as the insurance expense allocation item, which is a group item, that's where I'm going to put 1442.82. And by doing that, the system will take all these percentages, add them in there, and sometimes there will be a calculation error, right? It's just a decimal error, and then that decimal error just needs to be fixed at the end by changing this negative amount. And yeah, there could be the small chance that one of these percentages just they don't match exactly, but that's not a big deal. Okay, so once I have the bill itself, there's my expense allocation. I can save it. I probably want to memorize it. Let me create a vendor here called end of period allocation. This is not a real vendor, but I'm doing it this way so we know exactly what we're doing. So I'm going to do save and memorize it, and then we can memorize it, save it. I'm going to put it, don't remind me, because I'm just going to use it once per month. And the only piece that I have to pay close attention to is I have to make sure that this dollar amount matches my financial statement after I'm done with all the transactions, and this dollar amount is the exact negative of that quantity up there. And let me put here 11/30/2017, which was the financial statement we were looking at. I want to click on save and look at that report. Did I have it open already? Yes, I did. So I'm going to go to profit and loss, and then we're going to see how the insurance expense now was moved across the classes. As you can tell, we did have an error of a couple of cents there, and that could be fixed, mainly because I had read the number wrong, but I'm going to go ahead and fix that right now, and you're going to see how across the board, every single class has an insurance expense associated with it. And yeah, this 3 cents was an error in my part that could be easily fixed. So what we're trying to do is reverse this 3 cents. So that would be 84, right? And then that would have a 4 up here. Okay, and then we'll click on save and close. That was off by 2 cents. That was my fault. And then I'll close that, and then there we go. Nothing on there unclassified. So basically, at the end of the period, I can actually have one bill that has all the groups that are pre-configured for every one of these, and then all I have to do is take that number and plug it into the quantity side, and I'll be able to semi-automate. It's not automated, but semi-automate expense allocation across different classes or jobs.